Hi guys, I just wanted to start out my presentation by making sure that everyone was safe and healthy during this quarantine, and I just wanted to go over my 298 presentation with everyone. So the title of my paper and presentation is The Thing About Fashion: How Women's Fashion Changed During World War II. Just some general background information. The Second World War affected almost every corner of the globe in one way or another during the years of combat. World War II suppressed the sale and consumption of many materials and resources in order to ration for the war. The fashion and styles of this time were of no exception to the sacrifice. Due to the lack of available resources, women across America were affected by this shift in readily available clothing and accessories. My presentation today reflects on my findings and research in regards to the final research paper for 298. Just a description of my topic. Um, with the United States entering World War II in 1941, rationing began. Many materials were focused on wartime necessities and not on daily consumption. Women were the ones who were affected by the switch the hardest, as they did what they could do with the resources that were given to them to provide for themselves and their families at this time. Why this topic is important. So this allows a different perspective from the general World War II history that we are usually exposed to. The focus of this research was to broaden the understanding of the role that women played during the Second World War. This is important to include, as this gives an inside look into the lives of women on the home front, as sometimes I think that we forget that women also participated in wartime efforts, and I thought this was important to expand on. And why I picked this. I picked this because I enjoy learning about World War II, and I wanted to shed more light on the day-to-day lives of women who were at home on the home front in America. So my research question is, how did World War II affect women's fashion and how do they deal with this? And also, how did publications focus on the shift and how the publications affected women? So for my argument, I will argue that fashion magazines and other published sources played a critical role during the war in convincing women to make fashion sacrifices for the war effort, and I will also examine how World War II changed fashion and accessories during the war. So what did these women do? So, for example, when nylon stockings were pulled from public production, women turned to liquid stockings, which we will expand on more here in a minute. And when rations began, women began refashioning and remaking their older clothes into new styles. When Paris was occupied by Germany, America and England created their own styles and looks that fit a more wartime style and silhouette that we will also get into in the next few slides. This is important to note because Paris was the fashion capital in the world at this time, and with Germany occupying Paris, all fashions were stopped. And when women were called upon to take places of the men in the workforce and in the armed forces, women donned uniforms that were designed just for them. Since we already talked about some regulations, I'm going to go ahead and talk about the L85 regulations. So it was in the spring of 1942 when clothing rationing was put into place. The L85 regulation guidelines were set up by the U.S. Production Board. These regulations stated that certain materials could only be made at a certain time with a number of limited items that could be made from each of those materials. So there were some exceptions to the L85 regulation that was put into place. For example, religious vestments, wedding gowns, maternity clothes, children's wear, and burial grounds. They were all exceptions to the L85 regulation. Okay, so on the left there is a picture of a woman who is drawing a seam on the back of her leg. That is because this woman is wearing liquid stockings, and to complete the look of wearing the nylons, which of course in this time was going to be liquid stockings, they would take like a makeup pencil and draw a seam on the back of her leg to make it seem as though she was wearing the stockings. This is an example of how women were expected to do extra steps and do the most just to make sure that they were fitting in with social standards and fashion regulations of the time. And then on the right, this is an example of a wartime silhouette dress, because um, this is an example of how the styles change to simple designs. As you can see, there's not a lot of extra embellishing. It's very straightforward. The skirts are a little shorter. There's not an excess of fabric. It's a little slimmer fitting. This is an example of a wartime style dress, just because of the fact that um, there were the regulations put in about how much material you could have on an outfit. Okay, so going into the women's military uniforms. Military uniforms were adopted to look similar to the men's, but they were also cut into a masculine V shape at the top, and they were also tailored to fit women's bodies, highlighting the bust and waist. Now, it's very probable that these designs were designed in this way for the fact that they wanted the enlisted women, to look attractive to the men, as well as having attractive uniforms would affect women's enlistment rates. So if they thought that the uniforms were attractive and they liked them, then the women would also go ahead and sign up. As you can see on the right, we have an Army service uniform and a Navy service uniform. Both of them fit the same type of look, as they both have skirts and the top, and they're both cut with the V-neck, and they also have buttons. Buttons were a thing that civilian women and families did not have a lot of, just due to the fact that rationing took away all the excessive accessories from civilian fashion. On the left, we have a red dress that is also an excellent example of a wartime dress, or a wartime silhouette, as we've previously called it. As you can see, it's very similar to the dress we've talked about before, with it being very sleek, very slender, and simple. There's also no extra embellishing or ruffles or anything. The skirts are shorter than what they had been in the past recent years. The sleeves are going to be shorter, and the necklines are going to be cut a little different, just to conserve fabric. Now on the right side, we have an after World War II fashion look. So as you can see, there's a lot more fabric being used because there were no more regulations. There's broader shoulders, there's going to be padding, the sleeves are a lot longer, there's gloves, there's a hat, and there's a little piece across the waist that goes out. Stuff like that would not have been in regulation during World War II because of the fabric and material conserving, all of that good stuff. All right, so primary sources that I mainly focused on using newspaper articles. As we talked about before, liquid stockings was a thing that was very highly used by women during this time, and I wanted to include an ad of that, just to show you guys that it does say salvage your old stockings, the Army needs them. So this was another way that publications were pushing women to participate in the wartime regulations. I also used British Order strict clothing rationing, because this is actually from a DC newspaper, but it was talking about British orders because they were also going to be taking place in America, and they did talk about that, and they also referenced how the same type of rationing happened during World War One. And then on the bottom right, we have wardrobe for today. This particular article stated that women only needed to keep certain amount of clothes. So, for example, they said that you just needed one skirt, one top, one hat, and one dress, and you could dress them up or dress them down to fit whatever occasion that you needed to go to. So for my secondary sources, these are the main ones that I used during my research paper. Let's see here, the one by Martha Hall, American Women's Wartime Dress. This is an excellent source, as they all talked about how the styles changed, how it's affected women, what women did. A Scene in Vogue is an excellent book source that I used because it showed me how publications changed from before the war, during the war, and then after the war. And it showed me how the styles in advertising had changed during all of these years. In the Service of Femininity by Christina Rosa Nelson. This is a great one because this talks about American Foundation garments from World War II to the 1970s. Um, it talked about how how the clothes changed, but also how the stuff you would wear underneath the clothes changed due to regulations and whatnot. And then the impact of World War II on women's fashion in the United States and Britain. So this is an excellent source just based on the fact that the stuff that was happening in America and in Britain was also happening in other places that were affected by the war. And this was important to mention because they were all basically going through the same thing. So, in regards to the historiography of this topic, fashion during World War II seemed to be a fairly recent addition in the past 20 to 25 years. Um, and I think this is a really important thing to add to the historiography of World War II just because it expands on the lives and personal matters of women and families during the war. Some struggles that I had during my research, finding direct examples from newspapers and posters that were published during the World War II era, as some of them were really nice and I could actually use them, but there was not really a lot of direct accountability between the two of my presentation and my paper. And then finding clear and easy to see photos to incorporate in the paper and PowerPoint, because I did get these pictures from advertisements and newspapers from the 1940s. Some of them were very dark and I couldn't really make out exactly what they were trying to say, but I think I did find some good examples. So how my research changed over time, over the course of the semester, through other assignments that we have all completed, I refined and narrowed my research topic. So I had a meeting with Professor Farrell, and then we decided to narrow it down, of course, with the 4-minute presentations and a literature review. We decided to cut down my topic and to change it a little bit. Um, Research for the final paper really solidified what I wanted to do and how I wanted to go about my research in the topic. And then I also wanted to add how the war acted as an equalizer. And some major takeaways that I would like to mention. Women were key players in the Second World War, even though they were not fighting on the front lines, and sometimes I think we forget about that. Material regulations and rationing as a whole acted as a social equalizer, as everyone was expected to participate, no matter where your financial standing was. And fashion plays a bigger role in everyday life than we realize. Now, these are going to be the sources that I used and referenced during my presentation, and most of them are from my paper as well. And if you guys have any questions and comments, please leave them down below and I will get back to you guys as soon as I can. Thank you for listening to my presentation.